as well. Hey, Option Keto, Keto Mommy, Danielle, unhappily a housewife on keto. Welcome, everyone. And now we are live on YouTube as well. And we have a couple people over there. And then on Zoom, we have got, let's take a look here. We have Pat. Hey, Pat. And let's see, where's the list of participants? Here we go. We've got Christopher. Nice to see you again, Christopher. We have someone calling in from 916. We have a guest. We have Lewis, Loretta, two Pats, and a bunch of other people. We have Angela, Kelly, Browgal, and Caldera 2020. Tonight, we're going to be talking about fiber, everything you wanted to know about fiber, everything you'll need to know about how to use fiber to optimize your health. And we're essentially back to the regular programming. Last week, we spoke about sort of mindset and levels of awareness and things that were a little bit different than what we usually speak about. But I felt it was important because it brought together all the chapters that we've gone through. Many of you here on Instagram don't know, but every Wednesday night, I have a class. My name is Dr. Jonathan Carp. I'm a medical doctor in South Florida. I'm also president and founder of Miracle Noodle. And every Wednesday night, we talk about health. And on Instagram, you won't be able to see the slides why I use what's called the mind map, but you'll be able to understand everything because I'll be explaining it one by one. Let's take a look over at YouTube and see if that's working, which it is. And we can get started. All right, well, let me share my screen. And you should be able to see my screen. Let's blow it up a little bit and move things around here and blow it up. So I entitled tonight's class, Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Fiber and More. There's a lot of confusion about fiber. Insoluble fiber, soluble fiber, resistant starch. All of these terms are used and bandied about because there are different supplements that are used that are insoluble fiber, some are soluble fiber, some are resistant starch, prebiotic fiber, all these different terms. So my goal for this is by the end of the time tonight, you'll understand what resistant starch is, what prebiotic starch is, what prebiotic fiber is, what insoluble fiber is, what soluble fiber is. You'll get to understand how that works in your biology, but most importantly, beyond everything else, because we're really talking in my classes mostly about general concepts and how to, what I always say, become your own authority in health, which basically means learning big concepts so that you can make your own decisions. You don't need to know the details of all the scientific studies. You just have to have a general framework of categories in your mind so that when you get new information, you are able to sort of categorize it in your mind in such a way that you can use it and make decisions for your health. And when it comes to talking about fiber, the most important thing that is possible to understand is what are the benefits of optimized fiber intake. Now, we're not going to get into soluble, all those different insoluble, we will get into those. But let's start off by saying, well, what is it that we gain from planning out our diet in such a way that we are optimizing fiber intake? Now, you'll understand what that means by the end of this lecture, because you'll understand the various different forms of fiber that you can incorporate into your diet to get all of these benefits. So what are the benefits of optimizing your fiber intake? Well, you get a rise in HDL, which is your good cholesterol. You get a drop in triglycerides, which is something that is associated with a whole host of bad outcomes. You get reduction in insulin resistance if you're optimizing your fiber intake. Lower blood sugar, better bowel regularity, better bowel movements. There's a reduction in diverticular disease, a reduction in colon cancer. There's improved mood, decreases in anxiety, And also, believe it or not, there are effects in your gut that are related to hormone production that helps with appetite suppression. So all of these things, so many different things, and these are actually only some of the things that are a benefit to making sure that the fiber that you're getting in your diet are optimized for your health. And this is basically all of these things are going to improve if you get your fiber right. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. I might add that that basically we've been talking for an hour every Wednesday night, and because those first 12 weeks were really the things that I was focusing on in terms of putting together actually a book that I'm working on. So now we're going into further details. So these lectures will probably be somewhere around 30 to 45 minutes. But there's always very interesting rabbit holes that we can go down, and that sometimes probably will happen. And therefore, I just remind all of you, both on Instagram and YouTube, as well as on Zoom, if you have any questions, let me know, because sometimes those questions allow me to realize what maybe I'm not explaining fully. And so please, there's no bad questions. Just let me know if you have any as we go along. So let's talk about the history of fiber in nutrition and in the public consciousness, because in terms of all kinds of health concepts, it just so happens that there are often sort of common conceptions, misconceptions about certain things. And when it comes to fiber, we often have this sort of one picture of fiber in our brain, which basically usually revolves around grains and getting whole grains as a good source of fiber. And I'd like to take you through a little bit about how that happened so that you have a better understanding of how to clear that conception away to be able to get to a clearer idea of fiber, what it is, and how important it is for your health. So it all starts with a doctor by the name of Dennis Burkitt. And he was a doctor in, I believe it was in Uganda. He was an Irish doctor, but he was working for the British government in Uganda. And he is very famous for two things. The first is there's a tumor named after him. It's called Burkitt's lymphoma. And it's one of the first tumors that was identified to be caused by a virus called an Epstein-Barr virus. The other thing that he noticed was after he spent many years in Uganda, and then he came back to, I think, London it was, he realized that all of the maladies that he was seeing in his patients in London didn't even exist in Africa. Bowel problems, diverticular disease, colon cancer, constipation, all of these gut-related types of diseases he wasn't seeing in Uganda. And he noted very early on in his time there that the people that lived in Uganda passed huge stools because they were living at that time in the 50s on a very traditional diet of beans, or I should say berries, tubers, that sort of thing. And so they had an enormous amount of fiber. And he really thought to himself, well, it must be the fiber. And he took this message to the United States and he met with the cereal companies because he, at the time, believe it or not, you'll see in just a short moment that all of these terms, prebiotic fiber, soluble fiber, insoluble versus soluble, resistant starch, these are actually relatively new terms. The science here doesn't actually go back that far. In fact, when I was learning about Dr. Burkitt years ago, it seemed like he was one of these guys from the 1800s, but it turns out he was around, not too long ago. And he wrote a book called Don't Forget Fiber in Your Diet, which was an international bestseller. And he became the champion for fiber. Now, at the time, he really was on a mission to get the Western population to increase the amount of fiber in their diet. And at the time, really, the only sort of thing was that he came to the US, he met with Kellogg's, as an example, to convince them to, expand and to increase the brand content of their of their cereals. And as a result of that, he was able to convince the federal government even that we needed more bran. Now, bran, which is sort of the outer husk, is insoluble fiber. In fact, it's essentially cellulose, and cellulose is the same thing as sawdust, cellulose. So at the time, this was sort of, he felt that that's really all that we needed. Of course, the science was just developing, so we're not going to blame him for not knowing anything. In fact, in a sense, what happened is that this entered the food pyramid as a suggestion to eat more whole grains and cereals. But there's a lot more to fiber than bran and grains and cereals. And we'll get into that in just a moment. There's some memorable quotes by Dr. Burkett that I wanted to share with you because I think they're pretty funny and insightful. He said, the first quote he said was, "The health of a country's people could be determined by the size of their stools and whether they floated or sank, not by their technology." And of course, the question is should your stools float or sink? They should sink, because if they're floating, they probably have a little too much fat in them. Sorry, I'm going to pull up because I see someone's asking a question, and I want to make sure I can see these easily. So one moment while I try to get over to that. Let's see here. Okay. Okay, Sheila's asking, how does one know the amount of fiber is okay for them, and how to know if too much is not good? We'll get into that as the lecture goes on for sure. So definitely please do ask your questions as they come up. Okay, so back to Dr. Burkett's pretty funny quote. So the health of a country's people could be determined by the size of their stools and whether they floated or sank, not by their technology. Next quote is, "The only way we are going to reduce disease is to go backward to the diets and lifestyles of our ancestors." That is very, very true. Next quote, "Western doctors are like poor plumbers. They treat a splashing tub by cleaning up the water. These plumbers are extremely apt at drying up the water, constantly inventing new, expensive, and refined methods of drying up the water. Someone should teach them how to close the tap." Next quote is, "America is a constipated nation. If you pass small stools, you have to have large hospitals." I think that's a great one. "If people are constantly falling off a cliff, you could place ambulances under the cliff or build a fence on the top of the cliff. We're placing all too many ambulances under the cliff." Wise words from Dr. Burkett. So after Dr. Burkett was convinced, essentially, the cereal companies and the federal government, and it entered the public consciousness and the food pyramid, there were some studies that came along many years later to show that actually there are increases in health, reduction in diseases. Nurses' health study, physicians' health study, both showed reduction in diseases with increased fiber intake. And it entered the public consciousness without really much refinement, which essentially matched sort of the science of the day, which was that fiber was just fiber, and we didn't know much about the different types. And it was directly related to grains. I mean, even today, when you think about fiber, you sort of think about grains and not other foods. But as I said, this is essentially cellulose that we're talking about here when we're thinking about fiber. And cellulose is not digested by human or bacteria. So we want to refine our knowledge of fiber so that we can have an understanding of how the science has progressed since this notion that we think about fiber and we immediately think bran and nothing else. We think of getting more grape nuts cereal or one of those types of things. Okay. It is amazing, really, when we think about how much advertising has an effect on our knowledge base, just our general knowledge base. I could ask you, for example, to think about soluble fiber, and a lot of people will say oats, because a lot of the advertising campaigns speak about oats as being a form of soluble plant fiber. So let's talk a little bit about the categories. and the general biology so that you have a clear understanding of that. So essentially, fiber, all different types of fiber, is supposed to get to the colon unchanged. Now, there is something happening with a lot of people these days, which is called small intestinal bowel overgrowth. And basically, that's where you're supposed to have your gut bacteria is supposed to reside in your colon, which is the last part of your intestinal tract. And what's happening these days is we're getting a lot of people who have bowel, their bacteria in their gut has actually migrated all the way up into their small intestine. When that happens, then there's all kinds of medical problems. That's another lecture altogether. Well, the reason I mention it here is because there are people who, if they eat things like resistant starch, again, you'll understand all these terms in just a moment, and they have small intestinal bowel overgrowth, they can actually have an increase in gas and problems with that, because the fiber is actually not getting to the colon unchanged. But in a normal, healthy person, the fiber passes both soluble and insoluble, pass all the way through to the colon, which then we're going to see what happens when it gets there. Now, most plants have a combination of different types of fiber. As an example, wheat is 90% insoluble, as we spoke about. That's sort of almost like cellulose. Oats are 50%. They also have some resistant starch. Psyllium is mostly soluble. And we'll get into that in just a moment. But let's talk about the different types of fiber. So essentially, we have insoluble fiber, and we have soluble fiber, and then we have resistant starch. Let me blow this up a little bit for you. Okay. Let's start with insoluble fiber. Now, we know it doesn't dissolve, right? Because it's called insoluble. That's where that word comes from. But essentially what it means is that it doesn't break down. It remains intact. Now, it holds water. It speeds up digestion because the body is pushing it through. It can be fermentable, but generally speaking, it isn't broken down by bacteria. There is a fermentable insoluble fiber that some people call resistant starch, but for the purposes of this lecture, really, we're going to talk about that by itself, resistant starch, and not sort of include it in the category of insoluble versus soluble. So for now, we think about insoluble fiber as essentially just not breaking down, holding on to water, speeding up digestion. Now, when it comes to soluble fiber is broken down. In fact, it breaks down into sort of a gelatinous mass that turns out gas and acids, organic acids, that increase the biodiversity of the gut bacteria. That's what makes it so incredibly powerful. It is fermented. It slows digestion down as opposed to increase it. And many soluble fibers can be digested by the gut bacteria. Now, what happens in that case? So we're talking about fiber, which is not supposed to be digestible in a sense, but what's happening with soluble fiber? Soluble fiber is digestible not by you, but by your gut bacteria. And when it does that, it does some remarkable things. There is something called butyrate, which promotes healing of the gut and has a whole host of it feeds the colonocytes, which line the gut. It's an incredible thing that can happen. But on top of that, there's something called postbiotics. Now, postbiotics are basically chemicals that your gut bacteria release when they're digesting the fiber. And this is a whole brand new science. And it's going to be incredible as this comes by, because as an example, and I mentioned in another class, some scientists believe that, as an example, pomegranate has an enormous amount of benefits, especially for heart health, cardiovascular health. And the science recently is showing that it's not actually the pigments that are basically creating the net positive. In other words, the result, what's happening is that these pigments are being digested by the gut bacteria, who are then releasing another chemical as a result of that digestion. And that chemical is what's causing all the positive cardiovascular benefits. So that means that these benefits are not going to happen if you don't have the right gut bacteria. And in order to have the right gut bacteria, you need to have a huge amount of biodiversity of your gut microbiome, meaning you need to have multiple species of bacteria. And you do that by feeding your gut microbiome different types of fibers. And I'm sure I'll mention this again because it's so important. But if you concentrate your fiber intake on just one or two types of fiber, you're going to be missing out on a whole host of benefits. And the reason is because you need to cultivate biodiversity in your gut. And you only do that by really making a concerted effort to eat different types of fiber. Now, this is a concept that we've spoken about before in a previous class. And we spoke about it very specifically when we spoke about vegetables. Now, one of the rules that I like to teach people is that you want to eat from different types of families of vegetables. And the reason is because each family has somewhat similar effects. Like if you eat broccoli and you eat kale, all of these are in the cruciferous vegetable family, and they have the same overall benefits. But then if you eat something in the lettuce family, which is in like a family of daisies, that has a whole host of different benefits. So you don't want to stick to just cruciferous vegetables. And you need to realize that if you're just eating cruciferous vegetables, you're not cultivating diversity in your food intake, which, getting back to what we're talking about here, it's the same thing. You want to be able to get it from different classes of fiber, different classes of food that we're going to get into in just a moment. So this is a general concept that you should always think about, that as you're eating foods, make sure they're in different families, make sure you're getting as much diversity as possible, because the people who have the most gut diversity are generally the healthiest across a whole host of different things, from affecting brain health and cardiovascular health, obviously gut health. And a lot of people are fond of repeating what Hippocrates says, which is, he said that all health begins in the gut. And the more we learn about the gut, it seems like he was pretty right on, because if you are cultivating gut health, it means you're cultivating biodiversity of your gut microbiome, which you do by cultivating different types of fiber intake, again, which we're going to be speaking about very soon. So they're digested by the gut bacteria. And it wasn't until the mid-90s, actually. So this is that fibers such as inulin and fructooligosaccharides were discovered to benefit the diversity of the gut microbiome. I mean, so this is new science. And really, it was at that point that we started to realize that prebiotic fiber, again, prebiotic fiber, which is basically fiber that provides food for the gut bacteria, has the most impact on your health of all fibers. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't need insoluble fiber, like what we spoke about with bran and wheat, whole grain. That doesn't mean that those things are not healthy, but the fiber that has the most impact on your health is going to be prebiotic fiber. So what are the benefits? Now, we've spoken about most of those benefits at the beginning of the talk, but specifically when we're speaking about prebiotic fibers, better bowel movement, intestinal healing, reduction in blood pressure, blood sugar, reduction in cholesterol, increased HDL. We spoke about all these different things. And this is the fiber that your bacteria in your colon can digest, but you can't digest. So you essentially need to be cultivating this. They feed off of each other, because once you have the bacteria and it's causing you to have positive health benefits, if you stop eating the fiber, that's its food, it goes away. So remarkably, it is a remarkable science of the gut microbiome that we've spoken about in another lecture, but not so specifically, that essentially you need to consistently be eating a wide variety of different plants to be able to cultivate the biodiversity that is necessary. So let's go into this a little bit more. We spoke about, so one thing that's produced is called butyrate, which is responsible for a lot of the benefits we've discussed, but also we spoke about how there is increased science nowadays to point to additional chemicals that are going to be important when it comes to this sort of gut health. So most people agree, you want around 20 grams of this prebiotic fiber per day. And I caution everyone that variety is the key, as I've emphasized a few times, because I think it's, as I said, sort of a cardinal rule. You want to get them from whole plant sources. So another rule of thumb, so to speak, when it comes to nutrition is you want to get your food in its original packaging. Now, that doesn't mean there's not a role for supplementing small amounts, but the majority of the fiber, especially if you're supplementing prebiotic fibers, you want to get them from whole foods. And maybe if you want to get, five to even potentially 10 as a supplement, maybe you want to put inulin in your coffee in the morning or in your smoothie or something like that. 5 to 10, that's fine, but you really want to round it out with whole plant food sources. So let's talk about those. So we think about bran, right? But we forget that there are a whole host of different things here. Now, beans, properly cooked beans are incredibly healthy. I don't think you need more than a quarter cup to a half cup per day. Some people have trouble digesting beans, but keep in mind, and this is another one of those concepts, that when you continue to challenge your body, in other words, you slowly increase the beans, the fiber that you're giving it will allow the beneficial bacteria that digest those to you're feeding them, so they're going to grow a little bit more. And you're going to be able to digest them more as time goes by. But generally speaking, you don't need a huge amount of beans, but I think, a little bit of properly cooked, pressure cooked beans, quarter cup to a half cup per day is great. Peas, jicama is a great source. Asparagus, onions, garlic, flax. And I put this here just to remind everyone that you're only getting 2.5 grams of this sort of soluble fiber with a quarter cup of flax. So it's not sort of a one-to-one thing. So it just gives you an idea of where you're at and how much fiber that you need to take. But again, onions and garlic have similar type of fiber. So they would sort of fall into one category. Beans, of course, would fall all into one category. So you shouldn't think that if you have black beans one day and pinto beans the next day, that you are cultivating biodiversity, because they're, again, in the same family. Chia seeds, Jerusalem artichokes, parsnips, turnips, nuts, apple has 1 gram of soluble prebiotic fiber. And then, of course, there's supplemental soluble and resistant starches. We'll talk about resistant starches in detail in just a moment. And with these, you've got inulin, you've got acacia fiber. Of course, all of you are familiar with Miracle Noodle, and it has glucomannan in it, which has had so many remarkable studies over the years and was one of the reasons that got me interested in starting Miracle Noodle, because when I learned about the noodles and I found out what their ingredient was, the first thing was that they were low calorie. And then I looked into the fiber and I was amazed that there were dozens and dozens of studies on weight loss, on constipation, on cholesterol lowering, on beneficial benefits for people with diabetes, all of these benefits. It was like, this is a miracle. And that's why I call it the company Miracle Noodle. So you get that with glucomannan. You get a couple grams in a pouch. So that helps you get along the way. And it's certainly better than having to put use a powder, although we do sell glucomannan in powder at Miracle Noodle. That's something that you can use and add a tablespoon to your smoothie or something of that sort. And it's a great fiber, incredible fiber. Now, there's green banana flour, which is a resistant starch. And again, we'll get into that in just a moment. Tiger nut flour, which is now very commonly found in health food stores, also another really good source. And green banana flour is exceptional for diabetes, not just to help with with blood sugar, but some of the studies are actually show improvements in some of the extra, for example, some studies show that it helps with the renal disease of diabetes as well. There's an enormous amount of research around green banana flour. And actually it's just sort of interesting that I had made a YouTube video about resistant starch a couple of years ago, and I spoke about green banana flour. And one of the probably the world's leading expert in green banana flour reached out to me because there were a few things she disagreed with what I said. Of course, she was the expert, the world's expert, and she taught me a lot about green banana flour, and it is really incredible. It really is. And again, you don't want to just solely supplement with green banana flour, but it's certainly worth looking into, especially if you have blood sugar issues. You can also buy green bananas. I know that Dr. William Davis, who wrote the Wheat Belly, has an interesting recipe for buying bananas green and then slicing them open and sort of dipping them in chocolate. And I haven't tried it, but anyway, there are lots of things you can do with green bananas, but the green banana flour is an incredible addition to trying to get to that 20 grams. Again, you don't want to get 20 grams from only supplemental sources. You want to make sure that you're getting them from a host of these things: beans, peas, jicama, asparagus, onions, garlic, flax, chia, Jerusalem artichokes, parsnips, turnips, nuts, apples, etc. You want to get most of them from that, and then you want to get to your roughly 20 over here. Now, of course, if you're eating a plant-based, mostly plant-based diet, or you're eating a lot of plants, and you're following that general rule that you're going to be eating across families, you're probably going to get there on your own. That's why sort of big general concepts are really important. And we spoke about variety is the key. Your gut bacteria are diverse, so you need to feed them a diverse selection, a diverse amount. And this breeds species diversity, which makes you healthier. And the science behind how you develop new bacteria to digest and some of these soluble fibers is almost unbelievable, the way it happens. But your body is capable of having enormous diversity in these bacteria that it's just a remarkable thing that your body's capable of doing that. And again, a lot of this we didn't even know until very recently. So this is the most important part, no doubt, of what we're talking about here. So now let me scroll out here just a bit. And let's talk a little bit about resistant starch. Now, the reason that there is sort of this dilemma, I wouldn't call it a dilemma, I guess, but it's resistant to digestion. So that's why it's called resistant starch. But there are basically 4 types of resistant starch. There's RS1, which is basically, okay, Christopher's asking, green banana flour is something you can replace regular flour with and cook with. Unfortunately not. And the reason is because when you heat green banana flour, it turns into from a resistant starch to a digestible starch. It's still probably better for you, but you're not going to get all the resistant starch benefits, unfortunately. So you really need to, so you really can't heat it above a certain temperature. I don't know what that temperature is, but if you're going to bake, unfortunately, Christopher, it turns into regular starch when you cook it. But there is still benefit because I've seen some ways where people do cook it a little bit to get some increase in palatability, where you're still preserving some of the flour, but essentially if you cook it fully, most of it's going to turn into a digestible starch, unfortunately. So mostly has to be raw. Okay, so 4 types of resistant starch. First is found in cell walls, so it's not really accessible. Our resistant starch 2 is basically a crystalline structure, which is which is what breaks down when you cook it. So that's why essentially why it becomes digestible. This crystalline structure is not digestible. That's why it's resistant starch. And it's mostly found in green bananas, as we spoke about, raw potatoes, some in beans, some in oats. But green bananas and raw potatoes are really the 2 sort of big sources. I don't recommend people eat raw potatoes, first of all, because they have the outer layer has a chemical called solanine, which is toxic. It's sort of the toxin that when you get like a greenish potato, that's very toxic. Now, if you get raw potato starch, which you can buy as a fiber supplement that you can add to smoothies, I don't think there's an issue with solanine. But anyway, generally speaking, you shouldn't eat raw potatoes because of solanine. Green bananas, on the other hand, can be eaten, and you can look up recipes on how to incorporate them into your diet, or you can buy green banana flour as well. Then there's resistant starch 3, and this one is really interesting. It's basically what happens is when you cook rice, potato, or sweet potato, and then you cook it and then you cool it, you get like 1 to 3% or something or so of the starch from the potato turning into resistant starch, which just getting a little bit of resistant starch into your diet is beneficial. So even though you're still going to have an enormous amount of starch in that potato, and you've only got a couple percent of resistant starch that you formed by cooking and cooling, nonetheless, there's still a benefit. So I mainly like sweet potatoes cold for some reason, but I cook them at night and I refrigerate them, not because I want to get resistant starch, but just so happens that I do get resistant starch, because when you cool it overnight, as the starch cools, it turns into a small part of it turns into a resistant starch. Same thing happens with rice. And you can cook it and then cool it again, and you get a little bit more resistant starch. I don't know if anyone's done that many times, but essentially you get more and more resistant starch the more you cook it and then cook and cool. So if you're going to eat rice or potatoes or sweet potatoes, and you're going to eat them the next day, you save it and refrigerate it, you're going to get more resistant starch. So that's kind of a cool thing. And then we have modified food starch, which is made by by industry. So that is a resistant starch. So we're not really going to talk about that because the goal here is to get it from your foods. Okay, so let's close this down because we're getting to sort of the end here of what I wanted to discuss. So we started by talking about grains, and because that's sort of the general conception about fiber is grains. And what about them? Well, let's talk about it a little bit more, but just specifically about the fact that, one, it is mostly cellulose. That we've mentioned that cellulose is insoluble fiber, and there is a benefit to that. In fact, they've actually done some animal studies that basically showed that if you just supplement with, say, resistant starch, and you're not getting all the other benefits of all the other types of fiber, that there can be potential bad effects. Now, these are animal studies, mouse and rat studies. Nonetheless, it just makes sense that you're going to want to get your food in its original packaging, meaning when you you are going to be eating an enormous number of things, and you're going to get a variety of different fibers. So there's a push for sprouted versus unsprouted, sprouted grains being sort of healthier. Now, we all know that there are studies, as we mentioned at the very beginning, that show that people who are eating grains are eating observationally are basically have some reductions in different conditions. But that doesn't mean grains are necessarily healthy. For a lot of us, especially what we're dealing with these days, is grains often are going to make your blood sugar go up. And so therefore, everyone should realize that I believe all of you now realize that you don't need grains for fiber. And if your blood sugar is an issue, there is no question for a couple reasons. First of all, to try to get rid of grains. Now, we had a class all about why I believe everyone should try an elimination diet. And the first step in doing an elimination diet is getting rid of grains for a month or so. That is a dependable 5 to 10 pound weight loss. Absolutely dependable. I've seen it in patients many, 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 many times. And part of the reason is because your blood sugar stabilizes, your insulin level drops. And when that happens, you're able to liberate more fat and get rid of fat. So there's no question that you can live a very healthy life without grains. It's sort of been beat into our heads. And the reason I went into the history was so that you understand how that sort of happened. It happened because of Dr. Burkitt and the new evolving science of fiber, and then his influence on the cereal companies and the federal government, et cetera. But let's keep in mind that, again, for a lot of people, when they're on grains and you take them off grains, their blood sugar and a whole host of things do get better. So there's been a push to do sprouted grains. So what's happening with sprouted grains? Well, they basically take the grain and they let it sprout into a little plant. So unsprouted, the benefit is there is more prebiotic fiber. There is, as I say, there's a lot of cellulose, but there is some prebiotic fiber. There's more prebiotic fiber than when it's sprouted, because the prebiotic fiber turns into sugars when you sprout it. So that's sort of a potential downside to the sprout. Now, if you sprout it, there are less phytates. Phytates are proteins. I think they're proteins that, well, basically they bind minerals like zinc and magnesium and prevent you from absorbing them. When you're eating unsprouted grains, there are more phytates, so you get a decreased amount of the absorption of zinc and magnesium and other minerals. When you sprout them, there's less phytates. There's also reduced wheat germ agglutinin, which is associated with a whole host of things. It's called agglutinin because it causes the red blood cells to clump. There's reduced gliadin, which is also associated with a whole host of negative things, but it's just reduced a little bit, not a lot. So the negative benefits of unsprouted grains are still present. They're just less present in sprouted grains. So that's essentially my goal here for tonight's class, which we're coming to the end of right now, is for you to understand a few very basic points. The first point is that from a rule perspective, I've said it many times during the lecture, you need to really make an effort to cultivate different families of plants that have different types of fiber. Lewis is asking, what's the most common grain? Wheat is the most common grain. So my goal here is to reinforce a rule that we spoke about many, many weeks ago, which was how to make sure that you duplicate what happened many, many years in, thousands of years ago, where the average human ate something like, it's a huge number, like 90, I don't know the exact number, it's like 90 different plant species. Some number that is much bigger than you would ever expect. Now, we are often, many of us, if you look at people, I've spoken about this even tonight, that we are basically, many people just eating cruciferous vegetables, as an example. So you want to cultivate many different types of plants as much as you can. And we're so lucky these days that we can go to the store and we can sample so many different types of things. If you go to any store, Walmart or Whole Foods, whatever, there are so many varieties. You want to educate yourself about those different plant species, plant families, as we spoke about. But now you know the different types of fiber and prebiotic fiber that we're talking about. It is a reason to try new types of vegetables like Jerusalem artichoke or jicama. Jicama can be delicious. It has a slightly sweet flavor. I like to have it with a little bit of hummus, actually. But you can put it in salads, and this is one of those things where you want to start experimenting, and you will see the benefits as you continue to increase these things. It's really remarkable what kind of benefits you can get. So let me hit escape here for a moment and go over to, okay, Pat is asking, do resistant starches such as modified potato starch add to your calorie or carb count? And do they impact your blood sugar or insulin? So resistant starches are like fiber. So you would subtract them like you would fiber from the total carbs to get your net carbohydrate intake. And they are beneficial for your blood sugar and your insulin levels, for sure. So there's no question that you want to spend some effort in getting more resistant starches into your diet. You just don't want to make it all resistant starch. You don't want to take 20 grams of resistant starch. Now, there's a company, several companies probably, but one that I met at a food show called Gut Garden that has a mixture of resistant starches, which means that, you know, you could supplement 5 grams of that, and they have glucomannan, they have potato, I think they have green banana, all mixed into one prebiotic resistant starch blend. And I'm actually going to be making a video in the next week where I'm going to be making a yogurt that I'm going to be adding some prebiotic, some resistant starch to cultivate the yogurt a little bit better. So pay attention to that on my YouTube page. Christopher is asking, you stated that nuts were a good source of fibers. In previous sessions, you also stated that there were good nuts like Brazil nuts, but also said that there are bad nuts. So are all nuts good for fiber, or is there some better than others? So the issue with some nuts is that they're not nuts at all. Like, I believe that cashews are beans. They're a type of bean. And just like beans, improperly cooked beans, they're toxic. I think that the farm workers that work with cashews, they often get reactions to the shell of the cashews. Cashews are an issue because they have a lot higher carbohydrate intake. But generally speaking, even that has some beneficial fiber. The main problem with nuts is that people overeat nuts. You know, one handful of nuts is enough. And one of the problems with it is because most nuts, with the exception of walnuts that have a good amount of omega-3, have a lot of what are called omega-6 fatty acids, which we've spoken about before. And if you eat too many nuts and too many nut butters, as an example, then your ratio of fats is a little bit off. Likewise, if you're eating a handful of nuts, just a handful, and even if you had a handful of, just a handful of cashews, I mean, who can only eat a handful of cashews? Cashews, you just tend to overeat. So a handful of nuts is really all that you need for fiber. That's enough of fiber from that category. It's also enough of the omega-6 fats from that category. So just stick to nuts. And there was one doctor, one of the doctors in the vegan community, Dr. McDougall, who basically says, you know, in the wild, how many nuts would you really eat? You'd have to spend a good amount of time cracking open the nut, and you would never end up eating a huge amount because of all the effort that it takes to break that open. So different nuts have different benefits. As I said, the walnuts tend to have more omega-3 fatty acids, which is one of the reasons why they go rancid a little bit faster, because the omega-3 is a little bit more sensitive. Brazil nuts, of course, are known for their selenium, and you only need like 1, 2, up to 3 a day. Some people say take 3 a day, and that's the amount of selenium that you need. And if you take more than that, it's more selenium than you actually need. So to summarize your question, essentially, yes, all nuts do have a good amount of fiber, but you want to just get a variety of different kinds of things. So as I said, cashews are beans, and it would be helpful to look up the families of these sorts of tree nuts. So D. Querin is asking, what are the staples of the African diet that prevents some Western diseases? Any traditional diet, no matter whether it's Africa or South America, is going to prevent Western diseases. And the reason is because of the processed, devitalized foods that are in the Western diet, white flour and sugar, and this decreasing nutrient density of the diet. We spoke about nutrient density in another class, but if you're eating a traditional diet, which is different when it comes to different parts of the world, some areas are, beans and rice, or some areas are potato based, or some areas of Africa are cassava and different yams. All these sorts of unprocessed natural foods are going to prevent Western diseases, because I guess the real question is why are there Western diseases? And they are there because of sugar, devitalized grains, increased devitalized processed grains, processed oils, processed sugars, all these things. And as Dr. Burkett noted, the first thing that he noted when he came back from Uganda to London was that the people in the UK had these little tiny stools, and he was used to these huge, they were eating, I forget what the number of grams of fiber was that they were eating, but they were eating just an enormous amount of fiber. So they were going to the bathroom probably 2 or 3 times a day with huge stools. And here he comes back to London, and he sees, all the British people who are constipated and have little tiny stools. So hope that answers that question. Pat is asking, I buy Bob's Red Mill modified potato starch. Going to look into glucomannan starch. I didn't know you had that for sale. Thanks. Yeah, I think I'm not familiar with the modified potato starch. You can get just supplemental, if you want to do potato starch, raw potato starch as a resistant starch supplement. I'm not sure if that modified starch from Bob's Red Mill is like the resistant starch 4 that I was speaking about. If it is, I would probably recommend that you find a more natural source of resistant starch, like the green banana, that has a heck of a lot more scientific research behind it, for sure. And of course, glucomannan, which again we call it konjac flour on the website of Miracle Noodle. And so just looking here, so that's also an option. Okay. It says it's resistant starch. It just would be interesting to know if it's resistant starch 4, because if it's modified resistant starch, I would say it's sort of not completely natural, as opposed to raw potato starch, which is, resistant starch 2, type 2, which is that crystalline structure that I spoke about that's found commonly in nature. And again, you don't want to make sure that you are not, you're just getting, not too many grams. You're not going to get all, everyone shouldn't get all 20 of their grams of this fiber from a supplement. This is, you have to think about your gut microdiversity. In fact, when people supplement that, when people supplement one particular type of fiber over too long of a period of time, it negatively affects your gut microbiome in such a way that there is one type of species that of bacteria that naturally reside in your gut that actually digests the mucus lining of your gut. Now you want a mucus lining because it provides protection against, it's like a layer of protection for your gut wall. So what happens is when you're eating too much of a particular type of fiber and you're not eating for microbial diversity by just focusing on one thing, this one bacteria grows and grows more than it should. And when it grows more than it should, this particular one eats away the mucus lining. And when that's gone, then that predisposes you to all kinds of gut inflammation. And when you have gut inflammation, the tight junction between what's separating the gut from your blood gets wider, and you can get things spilling into your blood that you shouldn't get spilled in there. And that's a result of someone trying to do the right thing by increasing their soluble fiber intake, but without paying attention to biodiversity by eating a whole host of different types of plant fibers, both insoluble, soluble. Of course, the prebiotic fibers, that's where you want to focus on. And if you're getting the prebiotic fiber from a natural source, it's going to be coming in its natural packaging by nature, which means it's going to have insoluble, soluble fiber, different types of soluble fiber, different types of prebiotic fiber, and the whole host of benefits of plant diversity that go beyond just your gut microbiome to all the other things that are in these plants that we spoke about in the other lectures. So I hope that clears up a little bit about fiber. And again, I was planning on only going a half hour, but here we are, and we are fully up to the hour. So if anyone has any other questions, let me know. Oh, there is one thing, since actually all of you are still here. So if you could give me some feedback before I sign off. I'm going to go through some of the classes that I gave, and I wondered if someone could just, since many of you actually, I'm looking at people that are on the call, I would say half of them are who have been on multiple classes. What I would like to ask you is, are there any classes in particular from the last 12 weeks that resonated deeply with you more than some of the other classes? And the reason I ask is because I am going to start my book with the book that I've been speaking about. I'm going to be transcribing that one first and working on it first with the help of a friend who is a writer. And as a result, I need to know which one of those classes really resonated with you. Now I'm going to read them out loud to you. Just give me a moment. And then you're free to go. Okay, so we had, let me pull them up. Okay, so we had, and if any of you remember a class that really resonated with you in particular, put that on in here on the chat. Sarah's asking, how much do I need each day? Generally speaking, you want around 20 grams of prebiotic fiber from multiple sources. So here were the classes that we had. We had how to influence the health of those around you, We had in-home changes to optimize your health. We had a class called the 4 meals, 4 flavors, 4 vegetables, 4 fruits. We had one called the 7 lab tests you should understand for a long life. We had metabolic flexibility 101. We had understanding hunger so you can banish it. How to eat for your microbiome, which covered some of the things we spoke about today. How to properly prepare plants. That was where we spoke about different types of traditional ways of preparing plants, whether it was through soaking, sprouting, fermentation, that sort of thing. We had a class just on nutrient density, a class on toxins and if they're really a big deal or not. We also had a class on the 80-20 rule and how to apply that to your overall health. And there was one more that as well. We also spoke about how to use genetic markers to improve your health. And the other one was why everyone should try an elimination diet. Now, if you've been on most of my classes, and then there was a fasting for health and longevity. Okay. Okay, great. So we're getting, okay, so getting a lot of different things. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you all for typing that in. So we have, okay. So someone said understanding hunger resonated with her. The 4x4 and the 80-20, 7 lab tests, tonight's class, fasting, in-home changes, fiber, metabolic flexibility, fasting, properly preparing foods, fasting, nutrient density, 80-20 rule. Okay, well, they're all over the place, which is good. And thank you, DeQuern, for saying tonight's class as well. Okay, so no real standout. Oh, I guess fasting definitely stands out a bit for sure. So maybe I'll do that one first. Okay, great. And then I'll just check in here. Oh, and there's some other comments over here. Sarah, I think I answered your question. Sheila's asking what would be a good handful of nuts to have daily. I think, I think walnuts are great, almonds, pecans, a couple, I think mix them up. You want to get to, have some macadamias one day, have some almonds one day. I happen to have this thing, I'll just show it to you. I happen to buy this, it's called Super 7. It's like a mixture of, almonds, walnuts, cashews, macadamia nuts, a few raisins, hazelnuts, and a few cranberries. It's very low in sugar, and it's a handful, so I don't overeat them. And it just comes in these packs. I don't have any association with this company. And there's like a whole bunch of them in here. And if I feel like I want a snack, or I need a snack, then I have one of these. You want to get nuts as raw as you possibly can because they often fry them in sunflower oil and those sorts of things. So you do have to be careful in a way. Also, they can be difficult on your teeth, so you do have to be careful with that. So you can, almonds as an example, you can soak them overnight. So, and so you can soak raw nuts to make them both more digestible as well as better on your teeth. All right. Oh, and Lucy, I need to bring on Lucy. Let me see if she'll come. Hold on. Lucy. Lucy. Here she is. I think you can see her on the, come on, Lucy. Well, you saw her briefly. Lucy. Come on, Lucy. Here you go. Here, Lucy. Okay. Well, you got to see her. There she is in the background saying hi. It looks like she has a sock there that she's playing with. So thank you everyone for being here tonight. Next week, we'll be talking about chronobiology and the new science of circadian rhythms and how timing affects just about every organ in your body. It's a very, very interesting topic that at least I hope you find it interesting. And I look forward to seeing you next Wednesday at 8 p.m. Thank you, everyone, for your attention. Have a great night. Bye-bye.